So I've played Lawbreakers for about 5 hours now, and probably won't for much longer considering I refunded it. What can I say? I just didn't like the game on arrival, and have neither the time nor the energy to pick up another multiplayer game. And in those 5 hours, I have had some okay moments, and some other, not quite as okay moments. But there's already a real plethora of content out there dissecting the manifold aspects of gameplay, marketing, market, and player base. In preparation for some longer videos, I decided I want to do a short piece on Lawbreakers, a sort of test case, to lay down some basic concepts and sort of explain how something seemingly as apolitical as a multiplayer shooter with cringy tap-out Monster Energy marketing can actually really speak volumes. Something to immediately consider is the context in which the gameplay itself is placed. There's nothing altogether political about picking up a formless gun and shooting it at a formless target, unless you really want to start reading into things, and maybe at some point I will. But even something as basic as the tutorial turkey shoot of a video game can really have impactful political implications. A great example of this is Medal of Honor Warfighters. It takes place after the first mission, which is short, scripted, and handholdy. Instead of casting you as a Marine or elite warfighter, it puts you in the boots of a military intelligence double agent going undercover, or maybe rogue, in a clear XP of Al-Qaeda. Now, the fact that I can't truthfully tell you whether this character, Argyrus, which, by the way, is a Byzantine name meaning silver, seemingly assigned for no reason other than that it sounds cool, is genuinely a mujahideen or merely pretending to be one, is immediately problematic. Ignoring the fact that the tutorial is dissonant and broken in some fundamentally kind of stupid ways, the lack of context means that we're sort of left to our own devices to decide how we feel about, well, 9/11, basically, in the context of our fun shooting gallery video game. So here's the deal. After a quick little shooting and grenade gallery, one which is already politicized through certain imagery like Eastern Bloc surplus weaponry, shoddy construction, and nameless POC characters cast in explicitly antagonistic and terroristic roles, you, Argyrus, enter a bad mashup of the Kill House and Mile High Club levels from Modern Warfare. Remember those? Remember how the Kill House prepared you for a tough and gritty Spec Ops narrative, putting you in the shoes of a fresh but nonetheless elite individual pretty unequivocally? Well, this training mission puts you, the player, as well as Argyrus, in the shoes of an airplane hijacker. The thing is, it's not immediately clear. You run through the plane, shooting at a plethora of targets, obliged to knife some with your scary, ethnic-looking karambit, and finally storm the cockpit. So how, you might be asking me, is this problematic? And buckle your seatbelts, and maybe familiarize yourself with that word, because you're going to be hearing it a lot. By the way, when I say problematic, I don't necessarily mean offensive. I mean that it raises questions and causes issues of thought that it probably wasn't intending to. First of all, the amount of shooting you do feels inappropriate given your mission. Now, there's a long history of plane hijacking as a terroristic action, going all the way back to leftist political violence in the 70s. Hell, they even called it the golden age of plane hijacking. Did people get shot? Yeah, occasionally. But the intent was generally to hold the entire plane hostage, have it land someplace, achieve some political end, not to kill all the hostages. There's also the fact that shooting off a gun in a plane is, well, ridiculously dangerous. It can cause the plane to depressurize, which can cause it to crash. It could hit a fuel tank or fuel line, which could cause it to explode. More recently, you might be familiar with attempted bombings of planes and the use of planes in suicide attacks. Maybe the intent in this mission is to destroy the plane and kill the passengers, but if that's the case, then why are certain targets blue, denoting the fact that you're not supposed to shoot them? It's weird, I think, for the character to pretend to be a terrorist in a game about preventing terror. Yeah, Modern Warfare 2 did it, but recall a couple of things about No Russian. In that mission, you were explicitly a double agent. You were not obliged to kill any civilians. The actions were clearly and directly related to the plot, and at the end, you yourself get found out and killed by Makarov. Now, some games might want to cast you in a single mission as a member of the enemy, to either humanize them or to just show how truly atrocious they are. This might, one argue, be the case, but it's strange then to have what amounts to the player's introduction to the game's systems, the shooting, the cover, the grenades, collecting ammo from your squad mates, and the much-touted door-breaching system be through the rather distorted lens of a certain rather vague misunderstanding of Middle Eastern terrorism. Now, how does this relate to Lawbreakers? Well, it doesn't relate. Not directly. I don't mean to imply that there's a direct lineage between the two. They're different games, and Lawbreakers is both better and less offensive. But I think it's a good example of how the act of shooting a projectile takes on one of an infinite amount of meanings depending on the setting, the target, the shooter, and the weapon itself. So, Lawbreakers, then. Welcome to the Fight Club. I guess the best way to describe it is cops and robbers. I mean, right away, the good guy cop, bad guy criminal narrative is reductive and destructive and stupid, but that's what we're dealing with here. So right off the bat, the game leans really hard into that old military fiction standby of desperate times calling for desperate measures. And here's where I have to preface my commentary by saying that unlike Overwatch or even Rainbow Six Siege, comparatively speaking, Lawbreakers is kind of a non-entity when it comes to narrative. What I know about the game, I scraped together from reading the really difficult to access in-game character bios. I mean, seriously, you have to get into a game and then during the 20 or 30 seconds you have to pick a character, go into their loadout screen and read their bio there. You can't access it from anywhere else. I also watched one cinematic trailer and kind of scoured the pretty barren wiki. And that's not just because the fan base is small, though it is, or because additional content is on its way. It's probably not. It's because outside of a paper-thin explanation for the main gameplay hook, there's really not much narrative content here at all. Now, Lawbreakers is pretty vague about its setting, but one understands that after an event called the Shattering, magic anti-gravity pockets and a MacGuffin mineral called Hedronium started showing up. And because a bad thing happened, this became essential for the global community to form an international ultra-militarized police force. This is, weirdly enough, a recurring theme in hero shooters. Both Overwatch and Siege feature these concepts, and before you jump all over me in the comments, I know Rainbow Six predates these video games, but bear with me here. But Lawbreakers kind of tries to build out its world building a little more by breaking down its blue and red teams of Law and Breakers into sub-factions. Outside of, like, one sub-faction which has slightly different implications, there's ultimately really nothing to say. In fact, the way the narrative of Law and Breakers is informed by these sub-factions, well, it's ultimately to the game's detriment in wanting to present the Law as the good guys. Task is arguably the main good guy sub-faction, and their name stands for a bunch of words that Cliffy B pulled out of a dictionary. But two of them are important: transnational and authority. This tells us that in the world of Lawbreakers, there is one law, and no room to budge. I think that's fucked up, personally. I think it's fucked up that in the world of Lawbreakers, resistance to authority is met with you getting shot in the face with a big fucking heat-seeking missile. But hey, maybe the bad guys are really bad, right? And I mean, some of them clearly are. Two of the Breakers, Kintaro and Kitsune, represent the stereotypically evil Zaibatsu Shura, which is your standard vaguely defined multinational world domination desiring corporation. What have they done? Well, it's actually not really clear at all. Is it fucked up that we're still drawing from Crichton's Rising Sun for our understanding of Japanese business practices? Is it weird and uncomfortable that all the breakers who work for Shura are Asian, despite the implication that it's meant to be multinational? Yeah, I should think so. Besides from them, though, the pickings are actually really slim. You have these guys called the Syndicate, and I actually have no idea who or what they are, and neither does the game. Here, I'm quoting from the wiki. Although his motivations and goals, like that of the Syndicate who he represents, are largely unknown, what world authorities can all agree on is that he is extremely dangerous. Board shorts here, Zarya, and this guy from the front page of the Unity Asset Store are supposed to represent this, the most dangerous criminal organization in the world, but there's no explanation at all of what they do other than crime, I guess, for money. Which leaves the Lifers, probably the most uncomfortable faction in the game. They're supposed to be a bunch of former convicts who escaped prison during the Shattering, and since Kronos, their leader, is all over the promotional material and has an aesthetic that best represents their faction, I think it's fair to say that, as with Task, they're meant to represent the Breakers as a whole. Now, right off the bat, we have to understand that, particularly in the United States, there is a serious prison problem. Abusive inmates, wrongful incarceration, inhumane standards, these are just a few of the simplest, most practical problems, to say nothing of the ethics of even having prisons in the first place. The crimes of the Lifers are, first of all, really poorly defined. In fact, they're not defined at all, as far as I can tell. So what they've done wrong, essentially, the game is telling us, is escape from prison, exist, in a word. Furthermore, the game is even pretty clear about suggesting that these guys have suffered extensively at the hand of the law. The gimp mask on Kronos' head is a torture and execution device. I don't use that word lightly either. The game explicitly explains to us that he was repeatedly electrocuted using the word torture after a failed execution. Hey, first of all, torture is illegal in the United States, and Kronos is American. Second of all, electrocution as a method of execution is only marginally legal, and in the state of Kentucky, where he's said to be from, it's only legal for inmates sentenced before a certain date, which I'm reasonably certain is long before Kronos was born in the canon. What this tells us is that his rage, well, it's completely righteous. He's turning on a system that allowed his torture and attempted murder and is now attempting to hunt him down for the crime of their own poor planning. The real kicker, though, is this character here, Baron. I'm just going to read from the wiki. Baron and his family enjoyed their lives in Haiti until Task turned its attention on the nation. Caught in the middle of the conflict, Baron was sent to prison. He bears a grudge against all of Task, believing that they falsely represent justice, and while in prison, he was quickly adopted by the Lifers. He's now looking for his own form of justice against a group who he believes falsely represented. Wow, strong stuff. Notice a couple things? This supposed police force is suggested to have gone to war with a sovereign nation. And Baron's crimes aren't implied, they aren't even suggested at. In fact, the phrasing "caught in the middle of the conflict" would imply, I think, innocence. So whatever, you're maybe saying. Maybe we're supposed to like the Breakers. Well, there's a difference between sympathizing and liking. I like the Payday Gang from the Payday games, and I like the Combine from Half-Life 2, because I think they're interesting and well-designed. But I don't sympathize with them because I'm not meant to. Cliffy B definitely wants us to like the characters in Lawbreakers. No one does. I mean, Kintaro and Nash are okay, but that's like the closest I'll get. But he definitely wants us to sympathize with the law. This is a game that wears its heart on its sleeve about the uncompromising black and white morality of justice, and it does so by conflating the sympathetic lifers with two gangs of nefarious, savage villains. And let's not forget about the fact that Kronos is portrayed visually and through his extremely limited voice acting as a real savage fucking brute. Definitely not a tragic Solomon Grundy sob story of misunderstood bulk. The rest of the law factions are pretty bad too. In fact, I'd say that they're arguably worse as far as conflicting with the narrative. Like I said, you have Task, and the narrative does its job to establish them as an iron-fisted New World Order little man's nightmare. So how come they're so comfortable fighting alongside Vigilantes? That's not my wording, that's the game's. This guy, Deadlock, is explicitly stated to be a vigilante fighter in the vein of Batman, right down to the exorbitant wealth and the uncomfortable implication that he's fighting crime for fun. The faction he belongs to, the Archangels, are this really vaguely defined group, and I'm reading from the wiki here, of, quote, vigilantes that the law enforcement agencies seem to tolerate, unquote. They're run by this guy, Abaddon, and there's nothing I really want to say about him other than that he looks like he was pulled out of Destiny, which I think is stupid and just makes the game's art style look messy. Oh, and he's essential to the plot. No joke, the entire game's narrative, The Shattering, it's set in motion by Abaddon being a fuck-up. Which is really weird, I think, putting such heavy narrative significance on a single, rather unremarkable character. I know Overwatch kind of does this, but it's alleviated by the use of outside media, I think, somewhat. If you didn't dig around in the archives like I did, you'd probably never know that this guy is the fucking Frodo of Lawbreakers. You'd probably think it was Kronos. Then there's the Valkyries, the final, maybe weirdest faction in the game. They're also a bunch of vigilantes, or more accurately, a paramilitary organization that goes all the way back to the 60s? Where was I when that happened? Lawbreakers wants us to believe that as far back as the 60s, there was this all-female paramilitary organization whose motives and actions are never defined. That's important, though. And who now, actually, are gender neutral. Ooh, I mean, strike one for equality. Except for that they're still entirely represented in-game by women. Mostly, I think it's weird that the writer felt that it was important to note that men are allowed in the club too, but also worth noting that this organization predates literally everything in the game, but has no exposition or explanation. Also, there's this weird detail about how only women can use jetpacks because they're powered by X chromosomes or something, and that's not really offensive, it's more just silly. But it's worth noting that they are non-governmental. They're paramilitary, and that's weird because paramilitary is a really vague word. A SWAT team is paramilitary, but so is Al-Qaeda, and so is a PMC like Blackwater. So there's actually no explanation as to what the Valkyries are, other than that they're, I guess, significant enough that the one world, Task tolerates them, and that they advertise in the malls of the future. So taking on the whole, what's the narrative here? Well, like I said, cops versus robbers, which, again, is immediately reductive and unrealistic, but Lawbreakers' presentation of that narrative is more toxic by virtue of the fact that it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to maybe cast Baron as this conflicted rebel, but it can't because he's teaming up with the Nakatomi Corporation and the fucking devil. And it wants the good guys to be good guys, but it can't really do that either because they use murder bots and psychopathic cyborg millennials. I mean, this narrative comes through in the game's visual design. Like I said, the lifers are meant to immediately be identified as prisoners, though they aren't, because Baron just wears this cast-off motocross suit and Nash is a pretty nondescript robot. Only Kronos actually wears prison orange, and like I said, he might as well be a fucking orc for how humanized he is. I actually think Nash is kind of funny, if tired, because he only speaks in dumb pop culture references, which would be cooler if Maverick didn't do the exact same thing. While I'm saying things that I like Sunshine. I think she's a fun character. Her design is really distinctive and unique from the rest of the characters, who are all, for the most part, dressed like cast-offs from Titanfall. But what's striking about her is that the cartoonishness of her outfit, the big soft round lines, and the glowing pink laser heart, well, they remind me more than anything of Overwatch, which is an aesthetic that Cliffy B repeatedly lambasted for being too anime and being for kids. I also kind of like Kintaro. He has the smug Pepe look down flat, and the whole prima donna American Psycho douchebag thing is pretty overplayed by now, but some of his lines are kind of funny. Besides that, it's a mixture of uninspired and cringeworthy design. Boob armor, racially segregated classes, and For some reason, a white lady with dreadlocks, it almost reads like a worst of list, like the art team was stuck in the early years of the 360. Or, well, considering it is Cliffy B. But you know, that's not necessarily an indictment of Cliffy overall. I mean, Gears of War is technically socialist, or at least the cog is purported to be socialist, though frankly a few quick trips to the wiki will tell me that it's kind of a non-entity and not that well understood. And if I had to guess, I don't know that I'd say that Sarah's political background was Cliffy's contribution to Gears. So, in conclusion, do I think Lawbreakers is malicious? No, not at all. I think it's ignorant, and more than a little stupid. I don't really know what the circumstances of its development were, but it feels like it came out of a pocket dimension. And I say that because, you know, we are living in this sort of renaissance of multiplayer first-person shooters, I think, with Overwatch, Siege, Battlegrounds, Titanfall 2, which I will never stop standing for, and even Battlefield 1. And all of those games feel like they come from a modern design ethic, not kinesthetically necessarily, but culturally and visually. The minimally ahistoric, in fact not nearly as ahistoric as YouTube commenters love to whine about, inclusion of black soldiers throughout the already rather historically revisionist ranks of Battlefield 1 is very much a product of a zeitgeist that is marginally more understanding and accepting of minority experience and opinion. Siege might be a dirty gun porn simulator for people with state violence kinks, but it's a diverse one. And Overwatch, again, has a leg up on the competition by having its characters come not just from differing backgrounds, but differing ideologies as well. And even though it's a multiplayer shooter with no structure and no narrative gameplay, you get a really good sense of the characters just from playing, and an even better one from the supplemental material. Well, Lawbreakers doesn't have any supplemental material, apart from 2 cinematic trailers, one of which is grimdark, the other of which features some sinfully bad covers of Spirit in the Sky. And that's, I think, deliberate. The trailers and the lack of material, not the terrible covers. Cliffy doesn't seem to care as much about narrative in this case, although he does care about tone. A refrain on the press circuit was that he wanted to make a mature, edgy version of Overwatch, which is why he hired Justin Roiland to, be himself. And I mean, the amount of people that I've seen claim Overwatch is for SJW hipsters, I mean, I guess there is an audience for it. An audience of 3,000 players on launch.